Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Manning. I teach pastoral theology at Seton Hall University. So in one of the recent videos I posted, I talked about this crisis of meaning that's affecting our society. And what I want to do today in this video is just to elaborate a little bit upon that and talk about how many people experience this crisis of meaning in our society concretely. Today we live in what we might call a critical culture, which means that we live in a culture in which we really bring an analytical lens to a lot of what we do and how we see the world. So a lot of factors have contributed to bring us to this place. I recommend Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, in which he goes into quite extensive depth, giving the backstory to where we are today. But just to give a more simplified account, certainly the success of science has had something to do with this, that we live in a world today where the scientific mindset really dominates and really affects how even lay people, non-scientists, look at and think about the world. This scientific lens has created what Taylor refers to as an immanent frame. In other words, that we tend to look at reality as something that is explainable entirely in terms of natural materials, causes, and effects. And so we tend to only consider what is real. We tend to only give credence to what is tangible, what is quantifiable. And so one effect of this is that for many people, this brings a real sort of a lack of wonder, is that the world just seems to be kind of a flat and uninteresting place. Of course, the opposite can be true. There are many scientists who have a great sense of wonder at the majesty of the universe. But this is a fact for a lot of people, is that the universe just kind of seems flattened. There's nothing special. There's nothing supernatural about it. So the scientific mindset has something to do with it. But there's also a kind of flattening of time that we experience in the world today. Whereas in past times, in past cultures that were much more religious culture, there were lots of feasts and special celebrations, moments that kind of punctuated time and sort of changed the experience of time. Many people today experience time as flattened. So I see this in so many of my students, really just a lot of people, that everyone always feels like there's not enough time. We're working against the clock. And then furthermore, that really because of this sense of urgency, because we're always working, we might take some kind of break on the weekend, but then it's just more of the same. Life just kind of ticks on and on. So a consequence of this is that we tend to put a high value on efficiency. We want to make the best use of time as possible as we're racing against the clock. We tend to put a lot of stock in material success. Again, if we live within this immanent frame, and we see the world as simply just what presents itself to the eye, these material causes and effects, then our worldview is reduced to materialism, that success or flourishing for us is just about getting stuff and succeeding in our endeavors. And again, I see this a lot in my students, and I hear this from other teachers, that there's so much emphasis now on getting into the right school so you can get a good job, so you can make a living for yourself. Whereas in past times, Harvard had an interesting study on their students, that students today tend to think a lot less about meaning or about making a contribution to society than they once did. Now it's much more about just getting a job, earning a living. Okay, so we see this kind of flattening of time, flattening of our worldview. And I think this has partly to do with the prevalence of the scientific mindset, which is science, of course, has contributed much to humanity, but it has had this side effect as well. But then there have been other critical methods of scholarship. There have been these critiques of religion, going back to the Enlightenment in particular. And these kind of critiques have by now permeated the wider culture, and so we live in a time where many harbor a disparaging attitude towards religion, or if not disparaging, perhaps they're indifferent. At very least, we all, those of us living in the Western world, we live in a world in which we do not take for granted the kind of religious worldview, way of looking at things, religious beliefs that our predecessors did. And so many people do have this kind of critical attitude towards religious texts, teachings, practices. They don't take those for face value. They don't have the same authority they once did, and they're easily brushed aside as kind of fairy tales or nice stories, or maybe at best stories with a good moral. So many people have set aside these traditional sources of meaning, these religious texts and teachings and practices, and yet many are finding that there is, in the absence of those things, there's now this yearning for the meaning that those things provided. This is what we see in a lot of people who are leaving behind their religious traditions. And so people, we're human beings. We need meaning in life, so we try and fill that up with many different ways. In some cases, we just try and fill the silence. If we don't feel that we're finding meaning, we find ways to distract ourselves. And so I think this is a big role that social media is playing in the lives of many people. It's just filling that gap, filling the silence. But many people, after a while, they find that unfulfilling. They find that they are not satisfied. And so they're hungering for something more. Even if they have rejected these religious sources, they feel that they can't go back to it, that's a load of superstition, that it's childish. They're in this kind of in-between place, kind of a modern no man's land, where they're yearning for the meaning that religion provided, but they can't go back to the old religion because of so many problems that they see with it. So Paul Ricoeur, really, he summed up this kind of critical culture that we live in very nicely when he talked about the desert of criticism. And he says, beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again. So this is a place that so many people find themselves in today. This critical culture, this desert of criticism, this in-between kind of space. And I think all this contributes to what I'm seeing in many young people today, the great degree of anxiety and depression, and all this even before COVID, which is just making things so much worse. But unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression, very poor quality relationships. A lot of times that materialistic attitude being brought into the realm of relationships. And so particularly among college students, there's this hookup culture where there's no real relationship. There's simply people mutually using one another for physical gratification that in the end nobody really finds satisfying. And for many, it all results in a kind of apathy and disengagement. People aren't finding life meaningful, and so they disengage, they numb themselves, they drown, they try and fill the silence, whether by social media or some other kind of means. And so this is where many people are today. We've absorbed the critical consciousness from our culture. And many of us are finding this a very unsatisfying place where we are yearning for something more. However, there are those who seem to have emerged, who seem to have gone through this desert of criticism and come out on the other side. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next video, is telling the story of one person who did come out on the other side.